They thought I was just an old woman living by a forgotten lake, easy to manipulate, easy to erase. What they didn't know was that I had one signature that could take everything back, one stroke of a pen that would silence their schemes forever. This is the story of how I quietly protected my late husband's legacy, turning my home into something no one could ever steal again. My name is Clara Whitmore, and as I sit by my kitchen window, watching the gray winter clouds drift lazily over Willow Lake, I realize how quiet life has become. I am 69 years old now. Widowhood came for me 8 years ago when my husband David passed away. Since then, every season seemed to settle a little deeper into my bones, and every year felt quieter than the one before. Our house, nestled right by the gentle curve of the lake, had always been more than just walls and a roof. David built much of it with his own hands. He was a carpenter, you see, honest, kind, and strong in the quiet way good men often are. He had the calloused hands of a man who worked with wood, but the gentlest smile you'd ever see. This house was his gift to me, and now it's my anchor to the life we shared. I like to think the house has settled into the land just as I have. The floorboards creak in familiar rhythms. The porch wraps around the living room like a protective arm. The windows let in the northern sunlight that turns the hardwood floors golden every afternoon. There's a rhythm to this place, a heartbeat you can only hear if you sit long enough in the silence. Years ago, before David passed, we turned our little lakeside home into a sanctuary for other women, too. We called it Ladies by the Lake. Every summer, women from all around the county would gather here. Teachers worn thin from school years, farmers' wives aching from the weight of endless work nurses, single mothers, women with weary hearts and quiet dreams. We would read, share, and sometimes simply sit by the water, letting the breeze untangle the knots in our minds. Those days felt vibrant, alive. There was always fresh coffee-brewing laughter echoing from the porch, and the steady hum of female voices lifting each other up. I remember watching David on the sidelines, fixing the dock, or mending a chair, always quietly supportive, always proud. Now the dock stands silent, stretching its wooden planks into the frozen lake, like an old man reaching for memories. My days have grown simpler. I make small batches of strawberry preserves from the berries I freeze each summer. The pantry shelves are lined with neatly labeled jars: strawberry, vanilla-spiced, apple, wild raspberry. I tend to my little patch of lavender out back, even though the winters in Minnesota are unforgiving, and the flowers sleep under the snow for months. I fish in the early mornings when the water is still casting my line while mist rolls off the lake's surface. It's peaceful, but peace has a way of turning into loneliness when it's all you've known for too long. Holidays are the hardest. I used to love Thanksgiving. The big oak table David crafted himself would groan under the weight of roasted turkey, buttery rolls, and creamy casseroles. Blake, my only son, would sit at that table with me, napkin tucked in his shirt collar, joking about how much he could eat. Chelsea, his wife always impeccably dressed, would bring her fancy side dishes with ingredients I could barely pronounce. For a time, it felt like family. But these last few years, the phone has stayed silent during Thanksgiving. No calls, no text messages. Christmas, too, comes and goes with only the mechanical hum of the old heater and the soft pop of the fireplace to keep me company. Blake and Chelsea moved to the city 3 years ago. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a mother to visit and became, I suppose, an old obligation, something to check off a list when convenient. There were the obligatory texts for birthdays. Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you have a great day. Always short, always distant, like a courtesy more than affection. I tried to stay hopeful. I told myself people got busy. Life pulled them in different directions. But the truth became hard to ignore when even the simplest holidays passed by without so much as a call. On the first snow of the season, I walked down to the end of the dock just like David and I used to. The lake had begun to freeze over the surface, glassy and hard. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders, feeling the cold creep into my fingers. I stared out into the expanse of ice, and remembered David's words from years ago spoken while we sat on that very dock. "This place is more than land, Clara," he said. "It's a piece of your heart stitched into earth and water." Sometimes I wonder if Blake remembers that. If he remembers the smell of fresh sawdust when David built his first rowboat, or the summer evenings chasing fireflies on the lawn. Or if Chelsea, who married into our little family, ever truly understood what this place meant. Perhaps to them it's just acreage, square footage, market value. But to me it's the soul of everything David and I built together. After David passed, I promised myself I'd keep this home alive, not just as a shelter, but as a place where women could still come, where laughter could still echo. But time has a way of stealing things from you. First the people, then the noise, then the purpose. And now, more days than I care to admit, I sit in my rocking chair, and the only sound is the whisper of the wind rattling the bare branches. I try to fill my days. I volunteer at the library on Saturdays, delivering books to the elderly who can't drive anymore. I bake. I keep my hands busy, kneading dough, stirring pots of soup, as if motion could quiet the ache in my heart. But the quiet is always there, waiting in the corners. Blake used to call me every Sunday. We'd talk about his job, his house renovations, silly things like the new brand of coffee he was trying. Now, the phone stays still on the kitchen counter, weeks passing without so much as a ringtone. I leave it charging anyway, foolishly hoping that one day it will light up with his name. I know life changes, people change. But when you've spent decades pouring love into someone, it's a slow, hollow ache to realize you've become a forgotten chapter in their busy story. Winter comes early to Minnesota. The lake freezes over by Thanksgiving, the snow piles up higher than the porch steps, and the world outside turns into a silent white canvas. I used to love winter with David. Hot chocolate by the fire, quiet mornings watching snowfall. Now it feels like the season mocks me with its emptiness. Still, I wake up every morning, pull on my old knitted sweater and do the little things. I water the plants even though they wilt. I make my tea and sit by the window watching the world go by. I think of David, of the women who once gathered in our home, and I wonder if the walls remember even if my son seems to have forgotten. The house creaks around me. The floorboards whisper, and the lake sits frozen in the distance. Life, it seems, has settled into a kind of quiet survival. But sometimes in the very stillness, I hear David's voice, gentle and firm. "You were always stronger than you think, Clara." And maybe, just maybe, that's true. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon, just a few days before Thanksgiving, when the phone rang. I remember the exact moment because the wind had picked up over Willow Lake, whistling through the old pine trees outside my kitchen window. The sky was already leaning toward early darkness, and the first flakes of snow danced in the air. I had just set a kettle to boil when I heard the familiar chime of the landline, an old-fashioned sound that always made my heart jump a little, hoping for a friendly voice. When I saw Blake's name on the caller ID, my breath caught. My son, after weeks, no months, of silence, he was calling. I pressed the receiver to my ear and forced my voice to sound cheerful, steady. "Hi, Blake," I said, heart thumping against my ribs. "Hi, Mom." His voice came through smoother than I remembered, but distant, polished. Chelsea and I were thinking, we should do dinner. You know, before the holiday rush. Dinner. It sounded simple enough, but coming from Blake, it felt like a rare olive branch. For a moment, something warm flickered inside my chest. Maybe, just maybe, my son had remembered me. Not out of obligation, but out of real human affection, Blake suggested. The Silver Birch, the most upscale restaurant in the county. A place David and I had only gone to once on our 40th anniversary, splurging on lobster and a bottle of sparkling cider. I hadn't been back since. I swallowed down a mixture of nerves and excitement and said yes without hesitation. After we hung up, I stood by the kitchen window watching the snow fall heavier now, coating the lawn in a soft white blanket. My fingers trembled as I walked to the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. From beneath layers of neatly folded winter scarves and holiday linens, I pulled out my blue wool shawl, the one David had gifted me on our 35th anniversary. It was soft and heavy, a comforting weight on my shoulders, and as I draped it around me, I caught a faint trace of cedar and time like a whisper from the past. That evening, I took extra care getting ready. I brushed my graying hair into soft waves, applied a touch of blush to my cheeks, and chose a simple pair of pearl earrings David had once complimented. Looking into the hallway mirror, I hardly recognized the hopeful woman staring back. There was a glow there, a spark I hadn't seen in a while. Maybe tonight would be the start of something better. Maybe I'd have my family back. When the sleek black car pulled into the gravel driveway, headlights cutting through the snowy dusk, I felt a flutter of nerves. Blake stepped out first, tall, dressed in a tailored coat, his hair perfectly combed. He opened the door for Chelsea, who emerged in a chic, camel-colored coat that probably cost more than a month's worth of my groceries. Her boots clicked elegantly on the driveway. Blake approached with a practiced smile and kissed my cheek lightly. Chelsea's compliment came quickly, her tone syrupy sweet. "Oh, Clara, this shawl is lovely," she said, touching the fabric lightly. "Vintage is so in style right now." I forced a smile, tucking my hands into my coat pockets to hide the small tremor in my fingers. The politeness was impeccably rehearsed. A part of me chose to ignore it. I wanted to believe tonight was about reconnecting. The drive to the Silver Birch was quiet, save for small talk about weather and holiday sales. Chelsea chimed in occasionally about a new yoga studio opening downtown. Blake scrolled through emails on his phone. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur into the soft snow. The restaurant was just as I remembered. Golden lighting, high ceilings, crisp white tablecloths, and waiters dressed sharply in black vests. A soft hum of conversations filled the air, silverware clinking delicately against fine china. For a moment it almost felt special. We were seated at a corner table by a large window overlooking the frozen lake. Before I could order my usual hot tea, Blake signaled the waiter and ordered a bottle of the house Cabernet. I blinked in surprise. "Just water for me," I said softly. But Blake laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Mom." "It's a celebration," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Chelsea leaned in, her smile flashing. "One glass won't hurt, Clara." I nodded hesitantly, not wanting to be difficult, even though wine always gave me a headache. The meal unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Chelsea asked about my health in the tone of a concerned friend, though her eyes darted quickly, scanning me up and down. She inquired about my arthritis, the draftiness of the old house, and how I was managing all alone. Her voice dripped concern, but there was something clinical about it, like she was assessing a patient rather than chatting with family. Blake nodded along, adding small comments about how isolated the lake house was, how maintaining property taxes must be difficult on a fixed income. My appetite waned with every bite of the beautifully plated salad in front of me. Then, as dessert arrived, a pristine crème brûlée with a perfect golden crust. Blake shifted in his seat. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather folder. My heart sank before I even knew why. "Mom," he began, his tone smoothing into something businesslike. "Chelsea and I have been thinking about how to make things simpler for you." The folder landed on the table with a soft thud, but the sound echoed in my ears. Blake slid it toward me, fingers tapping lightly on the leather edge. "It's just paperwork," Blake said with a casual smile. "A small change to the property title. You'd still live there, of course." "Nothing changes for you." Chelsea's voice followed like a warm breeze masking a storm. "It's just about making things easier, Clara. We've spoken to some financial advisors, and with the market shifting, it's really the smart thing to do." I opened the folder, my fingers cold despite the heat of the restaurant. Legal documents stared back at me, black ink on creamy paper. My name appeared at the top. Clara Whitmore listed as current owner. Below it, highlighted in neat yellow, was a line that made my breath hitch. Primary owner Blake Whitmore. Life estate residency granted to Clara Whitmore. A life estate. The words settled in my stomach like lead. I would no longer be the owner of my own home, the home David had built for me. I would simply be allowed to live there, until death or until they decided otherwise. Every fiber of my being screamed, but I sat there frozen in my seat, the warmth of the restaurant pressing against my skin like suffocating air. Blake's smile widened, misinterpreting my silence. "It's nothing really, just a formality. This way we can take care of the taxes, any maintenance, all the boring paperwork." Chelsea placed her hand gently on my forearm, her manicured nails gleaming under the light. "You'll have less to worry about, Clara. You deserve to relax. Relax." After raising Blake, after maintaining that home for decades, after burying David with my own trembling hands, I deserved to be erased. Reduced to a guest in the only place I called home, I closed the folder slowly, my lips curving into a small, tight smile. "That's a lot to consider," I said, voice steady, despite the storm roaring inside me. Blake nodded eagerly. "Of course. No rush, Mom. We just wanted to get the conversation started. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I don't remember what I ate. I don't remember what was said. I only remember the weight of the folder in my lap and the hollow ache in my chest. When they dropped me off at home, I thanked them politely. I hugged Blake lightly, nodded at Chelsea, and watched their car disappear into the snowy night. Inside the house, everything felt too quiet, too big. I set the folder on the kitchen counter, its presence looming like a silent intruder. For a long time I stood in the hallway, my fingers grazing the blue wool of my shawl, breathing deeply, willing the tears not to fall. I wasn't angry, at least not yet. I was wounded. And when you wound a woman who has spent her life in quiet strength, you don't always see the storm coming. Thanksgiving came and went like a gust of wind, sharp and cold. I didn't realize how much I'd been hoping for an invitation until the phone sat silent the entire week, as still as the snow resting on my windowsills. The usual call. "What should we bring Mom?" or "Are you making your cranberry relish?" never came. The kitchen remained quiet. The dining table sat bare, covered only by dust motes dancing in the muted light of late November. I told myself maybe they were busy. Maybe plans had changed. Maybe it was just a quiet year. But the small town of Renfield didn't keep secrets for long. It was during a routine trip to the grocery store, standing by the canned pumpkin display, when I overheard two women chatting near the checkout line. "Blake and Chelsea's Thanksgiving party is gonna be huge this year," one said, her voice bright with gossip. "Caterers from the city, even a wine tasting." I stood there, frozen, clutching a can of soup. So there was a Thanksgiving gathering. Only this time my name hadn't made the list. It shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Like a paper cut you don't notice until the sting spreads. I blinked hard, put the soup back, and left the store without buying a single thing. 2 days later, under a pretense of delivering a batch of my homemade pumpkin bread, I drove to Blake and Chelsea's home. It was a house I had visited often before they moved to the city. A 2-story brick home in one of those modern subdivisions where all the mailboxes matched and every lawn was edged with precision. Blake's car sat in the driveway, and through the wide front window I could see a flurry of activity floral arrangements on the counter boxes of decorations on the floor. Chelsea opened the door wearing one of those soft cashmere sweaters and a bright, practiced smile. I could hear the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the murmur of distant voices. Clara. "What a nice surprise," she said, stepping aside. Come in, come in." I handed her the bread still warm and slipped off my coat, tucking my gloves into the pocket. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and something savory roasting in the oven. The countertops gleamed under pendant lights, wineglasses neatly lined up on a sideboard. I followed Chelsea into the living room, and that's when I saw it. Above the fireplace, where there had always been a framed photograph of our family. A 4th of July shot at Willow Lake. David, grinning in his sun hat, me beside him. Blake in his fishing vest. Chelsea beaming beside him. There was now a piece of abstract art. A canvas smeared with chaotic strokes of navy and gray and violent splashes of red. The bookshelf that once held framed photos of Blake as a boy, a family trip to Yellowstone, even David and me on our wedding day, now displayed modern sculptures and designer books, their spines untouched. My eyes traveled slowly around the room, searching for even the smallest trace of history, of belonging. There was none. Chelsea noticed my lingering gaze and gave a soft laugh, tucking her hair behind her ear. "We've been redecorating," she said lightly. "Minimalism is so refreshing, don't you think? Everything feels so clean and uncluttered now." I pressed my lips into a polite smile, willing my hands not to tremble. Of course I managed to say, though my voice felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Very modern. She led me to the kitchen, talking about catering menus and new holiday traditions. I nodded where appropriate, murmured polite agreements, but my mind was somewhere else, circling like a lost bird around the gaping emptiness where our family had once stood. At one point, Blake came in juggling a phone call and a laptop, giving me a distracted smile and a quick hug before disappearing back into his home office. No time for conversation. No warmth behind his eyes. After an awkward 15 minutes, I excused myself, claiming I had errands to run. Chelsea hugged me goodbye, her arms light and perfunctory, and I stepped back into the sharp winter air. The drive back home felt longer than usual, the road winding through bare trees, their branches like skeletal fingers, clawing at a gray sky. The world outside looked as cold as I felt inside. Later that evening, I stood in my own living room, tracing my fingers along the edges of photographs that still sat proudly on my shelves. David with his crinkled eyes and wide smile. Blake as a boy, fishing rod in hand, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Old Christmas cards, family picnics, David's woodwork awards. My life, our life, preserved in small, tender memories. But in Blake's house, none of it remained. I had been erased. It wasn't just the pictures or the Thanksgiving invite or the absence of my name on the holiday roster. It was something deeper, a slow, methodical cutting of ties, like being gently nudged out of the family story until you simply vanished. The walls around me creaked as the wind howled outside, whistling through the chimney like a mournful tune. I settled into David's old armchair, pulling the wool shawl tight around my shoulders, the soft fabric pressing against my neck like a gentle embrace. The house felt colder tonight, the silence heavier. I closed my eyes and tried to summon warmth from the past, from the laughter we used to share around the Thanksgiving table, from the smell of David's pecan pie, from Blake's boyish excitement about holiday parades and his clumsy attempts at carving turkey. But memories can only warm you so much before the cold reality settles in. I thought about what Chelsea had said. Minimalism. Clean. Uncluttered. I knew what it meant. It meant there was no room for me anymore. Legacy wasn't just about property deeds or family photographs. It was about being woven into the fabric of people's lives, about your story continuing through the next generation. And sitting in that chair in a house filled with empty quiet, I realized mine was being cut away, thread by thread. I let the sadness come. Let it wash over me like a tide. I didn't fight it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Willow Lake in icy silence. And in the stillness, I heard David's voice, a memory carried on the wind, warm and steady. Legacy is more than land. Clara, he'd said one summer evening by the dock, his hand resting gently over mine. It's what anchors your soul. My eyes fluttered open, gaze drifting toward the darkened lake through the window. The house creaked again, but this time it sounded like a heartbeat. Steady, resilient. I realized in that moment that my legacy wasn't in Blake's house or his walls. It was in the stories held within these weathered floorboards, in the women who had gathered here, in the laughter that once floated over the lake. It lived in me. And though I'd been erased from their picture frames, my story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Winter deepened its grip on Willow Lake. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the snow lay thick across the hills like a heavy blanket. Inside the house, the radiator hummed softly, trying its best to keep the chill at bay. I busied myself as always. Small comforts, daily routines. I thought perhaps the worst had passed after that Thanksgiving. I was wrong. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was in the back garden, bundled up in my coat and thick wool mittens, tending to the stubborn roots of my lavender plants. Most people thought I was foolish to keep a winter garden, but the ritual grounded me, clearing away dried stalks, brushing off snow, letting my hands work while my mind wandered. These small motions had kept me sane through the cold seasons. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air so crisp I could hear every little sound. That's probably why the voices carried so clearly through the thicket of bare lilac bushes separating my property from the neighbors'. Chelsea's voice. Sharp, confident, slicing through the quiet like a blade. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the wind had shifted just enough to carry every syllable across the snow-dusted yard straight to my ears. Absolutely, the branding is the heart of it, Chelsea was saying. Her tone all business, brisk and unwavering. It's not just a retreat, it's a lifestyle destination. We're calling it Whitmore Haven. Wellness at the lake. I froze where I knelt, hand-gripping a clump of dry roots. My breath caught in my throat, sharp and cold as the winter air. I strained to listen, barely daring to move. Clara's history with the women's gatherings. That's gold. Chelsea continued pacing back and forth on their patio phone, pressed tight against her ear. We can spin it as a legacy of empowerment, authenticity, all those emotional buzzwords. It'll give us credibility. Makes the whole project feel soulful. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I mean, think about it. Chelsea's voice took on a giddy edge. We keep her story alive just enough for press appeal, but obviously it's our project now. The investors love the narrative. Rustic charm meets modern wellness. We'll pull in corporate retreats, weekend workshops, premium packages. It's practically writing itself. I crouched lower behind the bushes, my back pressing against the rough bark of the old maple tree. The familiar landscape around me, the garden, the porch, the glistening frozen lake in the distance, blurred at the edges. The earth beneath my knees felt suddenly foreign, like I was no longer standing on my own ground. It wasn't just the land they wanted. It was my story, my name, my life's work. Everything David and I had built, every woman we had welcomed here, every moment of love and purpose. I was to be repackaged, repurposed, sold to strangers seeking weekend enlightenment. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it sucked the breath right out of me. I didn't cry. I didn't storm over there demanding answers or shouting accusations. I knelt there in the snow for a long time, my hands numb my body, aching from the cold, letting the reality settle deep into my bones. The snowflakes fell gently around me, silent witnesses to the fracture that had just split my world in two. It was like feeling winter crawl inside my chest, a frost that reached beyond skin and bone right down to my soul. When I finally stood up, I felt brittle, fragile, like one wrong movement would cause me to crack into pieces. I went back inside the house, shutting the door softly behind me. The walls seemed to press in around me, the familiar furniture suddenly distant and hollow. But there on the far wall of the living room hung the old photograph from one of our earliest Ladies by the Lake retreats. 15 women gathered around the dock, arms, linked faces, glowing with freedom, hope, and fierce determination. Women who had walked through life's fires and come out stronger, women who had laughed and cried and healed right here on this land. That's when I felt something shift deep within me. Not anger, not grief, but something quieter, sturdier, like a dormant flame sparking back to life, small but unyielding. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the old storage room. It had been years since I touched the boxes stacked in there. Years since I thought about ledgers and records and rosters. But my feet carried me forward as though they knew exactly where I needed to go. The room smelled of old wood paper and lavender oil that had long since faded. Dust particles swirled in the air as I pulled back the heavy plastic sheets covering the shelves. There they were. Boxes labeled in David's neat handwriting, Ladies by the Lake financial records, participant rosters, letters and testimonials, event ledgers, handwritten notes on workshop topics, grant applications, thank you letters from women who had sat in my living room, stood on my dock, cried under the wide-open sky, and left this place feeling whole again. One by one, I dragged the boxes into the living room, stacking them neatly on the great oak table. My hands, stiff from cold, began pulling open the lids, revealing pages upon pages of our story. I found notebooks with my own scribbles, budgeting worksheets, showing how we built everything from scratch, thank you cards from women who had turned their lives around, photographs of pottery classes, book readings, late-night bonfires by the shore. Every document was a testament to what this land was truly about. Not money, not luxury retreats, but community healing connection. I opened one faded envelope, and out fell a letter from a woman named Eleanor who had come to us after surviving the loss of her husband. Her words danced off the page, raw and real. You helped me find myself again. This lake gave me breath when the world suffocated me. My chest tightened as I read through page after page of these memories. These weren't commodities. This wasn't a brand. This was legacy in its truest form. A living, breathing reminder of what mattered. And Blake, Chelsea. They wanted to sell it to the highest bidder, dressed up in slick brochures and curated Instagram posts. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table until dawn, surrounded by the life I thought I had lost, the life they wanted to erase. Every document, every photograph, every ink-stained memory reignited something inside me. They thought I was alone. They thought I was old and powerless. But I had roots here deeper than any contract, stronger than any corporate scheme. And roots can crack through stone. As the sun crept up over Willow Lake, casting a pale golden light through the frost-laced windows, I smiled to myself for the first time in a long while. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I hadn't stepped into my old office in years. The room was small, tucked at the back of the house, its walls lined with shelves that once brimmed with purpose. After David passed, it became more of a storage closet, a quiet little cave where I stashed away paperwork I didn't want to think about. But that day, as the early winter light streamed in through the narrow window, the room felt different. It felt like a beginning. I sat down at the weathered oak desk David had built for me so many years ago. My fingers, though stiff from the cold, moved with certainty as I opened the heavy leather address book. I flipped through its yellowed pages, passing old scribbled notes and crossed-out numbers, until I found the names that felt like home. The first call was to Donna Rivers. I hadn't spoken to Donna in nearly 2 years, but she answered the phone like no time had passed at all. She'd always had that brisk, no-nonsense tone. Managing the Renfield Community Center had given her the skill of getting straight to the point. "Clara," she said, "it's good to hear your voice. What's going on?" I didn't waste time. I told her everything. Blake, Chelsea. The dinner, the documents, the overheard conversation about branding my life's work into some glossy wellness resort. I could hear her sharp inhale on the other end of the line, followed by a silence that pulsed with quiet fury. "I'll be at your place tomorrow afternoon," she said simply. "We're not letting this happen." My second call was to Lucille Hartman, retired librarian and the most meticulous record keeper I'd ever met. Lucille had been part of our Ladies by the Lake programs from the start, always the quiet observer who remembered every detail, every name, every story. She answered after the first ring, and when I explained everything, her calm, measured voice carried the weight of unwavering loyalty. "I've still got copies of our grant proposals, Clara," she told me. Newspaper clippings, too. Photographs. We built something real here, something we can prove. You just tell me what you need. Then Patricia Chen. Fierce creative Patricia, who had once turned our dock into a watercolor classroom, who brought color and life to every gathering. She was still teaching art classes at the local high school, but she promised to come by in the evenings, bringing fresh ideas and bold energy to whatever plan we crafted. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt lighter than I had in months. My hands didn't tremble anymore. My heart didn't ache quite so much. I had my people, my sisters in arms, and I wasn't going to let Blake or Chelsea erase the heart of Willow Lake without a fight. The next afternoon, the four of us sat around my big wooden kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of dusty records, old photographs, and memories stacked a mile high. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the room with the comforting scent of black tea and honey. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the air pulsed with determination. Donna was the first to speak, tapping a pen against her notebook. We need to make this bigger than personal feelings. If we go toe-to-toe with them, they'll make it about sentimentality versus modern progress. We need a structure. Legal protection. Lucille nodded, adjusting her glasses. The land needs to be shielded from private ownership altogether. Patricia leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming. A community trust. I've seen this done before in other towns. You put the land into a nonprofit. It can't be sold. It exists for the community. It sounded like the answer I hadn't dared hope for. But we needed more than good intentions. We needed ironclad legal grounding. That's when Donna spoke up again, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. We'll need to talk to Gordon. The name sparked a flicker of warmth in my chest. Mr. Harold Gordon. Our town's semi-retired attorney, a man who had known David and me for decades. He had handled our original land deeds, helped us through the paperwork of starting Ladies by the Lake, and was famous for his stubborn integrity. I called him the very next morning. His secretary answered. An old friend as well, and after a brief explanation, she squeezed me in for an appointment that very afternoon. Mr. Gordon's office sat on Main Street, wedged between the pharmacy and a local diner. The building smelled faintly of tobacco, old books, and polished wood, a smell that carried memories of simpler times. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his back slightly hunched with age, but his eyes still sharp as steel. I laid it all out for him. The manipulation, the threats masked as polite gestures, the plans to convert my life's work into a profit machine. When I was done, he sat back, steepling his fingers, and let out a thoughtful hum. You could fight them for ownership, he said slowly, but that's their playing field. They'll argue about streamlining, man, about efficiency. You'll come off as sentimental. But if we remove the concept of ownership altogether, if you transfer the land into a community trust, suddenly it's not just about you. It's about the legacy of Willow Lake. Hope bloomed quietly in my chest. Tell me more, I said. And so he did. We would create a nonprofit trust called Voices by Willow Lake Fund. The purpose would be simple and legally binding: to preserve the land for community use for educational workshops, women's gatherings, and heritage events. The trust would be managed by a board of directors. Myself, Donna, Lucille, and Patricia. According to the bylaws, the land could never be sold for private commercial development without unanimous approval, something we would never give. By transferring the deed, I would no longer technically own Willow Lake, but it would be protected in the truest, deepest way possible. Mr. Gordon leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Once this is done, Clara, no slick sales pitch, no investor, no manipulative child can touch that land. It becomes a fortress, not made of stone but of law. I swallowed back the lump in my throat and nodded. Let's do it. The following week was a flurry of paperwork signatures and legal filings. Donna managed the logistics like the professional she was. Lucille gathered every scrap of historical proof. Patricia designed the trust's emblem and letterheads, bringing beauty into every detail. I sat through every meeting, every discussion, feeling more alive than I had in years. And then the day arrived. I sat in Mr. Gordon's office, pen in hand, the thick deed papers in front of me. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Perhaps because I knew I wasn't just signing away a piece of land. I was signing away fear, erasing helplessness, reclaiming dignity. With one smooth motion, I wrote my name across the dotted line sealing Willow Lake's future. A quiet peace settled over me. The house would no longer be vulnerable to manipulation. The memories wouldn't be reduced to slogans. The land wouldn't be carved into a commodity. It would remain as it always was, a place of healing, of reflection, of strength. As I walked out of that office, the snow had slowed to a gentle drift, swirling softly in the winter air. My footsteps felt steady, my shoulders light. I wasn't alone. I had allies. I had a plan. And for the first time in a long time, I had certainty. No one was going to steal Willow Lake from me. Not my son. Not his ambitious wife. Not anyone. Not ever. The winter days rolled forward, but this time there was no quiet surrender in me. There was movement, quiet but certain. Purpose replaced my isolation. The four of us, Donna, Lucille, Patricia, and I, became a quiet force. Not an army marching into battle, but a current underneath the frozen surface, steady, determined, and impossible to stop. We didn't call out Blake or Chelsea. There were no heated confrontations, no angry letters, no dramatic announcements. That would have been too easy for them to dismiss. Too easy for them to twist the story into sentimental old woman refuses to accept progress. No. This fight would be different. It would be quiet, dignified, and far more powerful than they could imagine. Donna was the first to make her move. She attended her usual Rotary Club meetings, the same group where Blake had occasionally boasted about his business ventures. She didn't speak of betrayal or family disputes. Instead, in that warm, rustic meeting hall filled with town council members and local business owners, she began to tell stories. She spoke about Willow Lake, about the workshops that had once breathed life into countless women. She spoke of my home not as a house, but as a living piece of community history. She shared how women had come after heartbreak, after loss, after feeling forgotten, and had left with their heads held higher. One week it was a short story about Eleanor who had found courage after widowhood. Another week it was about Marion who had launched her small business after attending one of our weekend workshops. Donna spoke simply, gently, and always with a soft smile that didn't demand sympathy. It inspired respect. Her words wove themselves into the town's consciousness like gentle snow settling on familiar rooftops. No drama, just quiet, steadfast truth. Meanwhile, Lucille worked from her corner of the world. Though her knees ached and her eyesight needed thick glasses, her fingers danced effortlessly across her computer keyboard. She reached out to the local Renfield Gazette, an old paper that still held weight in our small community. Lucille was clever. She never submitted rants or accusatory letters. Instead, she proposed a series titled Legacies of Renfield, highlighting places in our county that held historical and emotional value. Of course, one of the first features was Willow Lake. The article appeared one quiet Sunday morning, a 2-page spread with a photograph of the frozen shoreline, the dock stretching out under a soft blanket of snow, and the old house standing strong in the background. The headline read, "A Quiet Harbor, How One Lakeside Home Helped Shape Women's Stories for Generations." The story recounted the humble beginnings of Ladies by the Lake, the long weekends of community, the generational impact. It highlighted the workshops that had empowered women from all walks of life with heartfelt quotes from past attendees. There was not a single mention of Blake or Chelsea. No accusations, no bitterness, just a love letter to everything good and pure about Willow Lake. I knew the article had landed exactly where it needed to when I went to the post office the following week. Mrs. Caldwell, who usually only nodded at me politely, smiled widely, and said, "Clara, I didn't know you'd done so much for the town. That piece in the Gazette, it was beautiful. Patricia worked her magic in her own vibrant way. She didn't write articles or attend formal meetings. Patricia painted, created, and breathed life into events that made people feel, Within weeks, she had organized a community event called the Women's Legacy Walk. It wasn't grand or extravagant, just a simple, heartfelt gathering at Willow Lake's Community Pavilion. She sent out invitations to women across the county, especially those who had once attended Ladies by the Lake retreats. Some of these women I hadn't seen in decades. On the morning of the event, I stood by the lake wrapped in my favorite shawl, watching cars roll down the snow-packed driveway. They came in clusters. Mothers, grandmothers, daughters. Some carried thermoses of coffee. Others bundled their children in thick coats, laughter spilling into the chilly morning air. Patricia set up canvases on easels under the open sky, inviting women to paint small tributes to their personal journeys. Donna had organized hot cider and pastries, and Lucille had printed handouts about the history of the workshops. But it wasn't the cider or the paintings that made my throat tighten. It was the stories. One by one, women stood by the crackling fire pit and spoke. They spoke of weekends at Willow Lake when their hearts had been broken, and how they'd found strength again. They spoke of learning how to trust their voice, of finding friendships, of reclaiming confidence they thought they had lost forever. There was laughter. There were tears. There were warm embraces between old friends who had lost touch, but were brought together again by a shared thread that ran deeper than time. No one mentioned Blake. No one mentioned Chelsea. This wasn't about them. It never had been. This was about us. About the quiet power that blooms in places of safety and community. About a lake that had listened to countless confessions, witnessed countless victories, and held space for healing when the world outside had offered none. Over the next few weeks, ripples from our efforts began to show in small, subtle ways. Local pastors began referencing the importance of legacy in their sermons. Church bulletins carried notes about the Voices by Willow Lake Fund. Younger women from the high school asked Patricia about art scholarships connected to the fund. The grocery clerk mentioned how inspiring it was to see older women taking charge of history instead of letting it be rewritten by others. And through it all, not a word of conflict was uttered. Not a single accusation spoken aloud. We didn't need to attack Blake and Chelsea. We didn't need to defend ourselves. Our truth was doing the work for us. It was something David had told me long ago when we first started our workshops by the water's edge. You don't have to shout to be heard, Clara. Sometimes the softest voices leave the deepest echoes. As winter pressed on, the town of Renfield didn't see an angry feud unfolding. They saw a community reclaiming its roots, women standing tall, history being protected, and dignity being preserved. And Blake and Chelsea. They remained silent. I imagined they felt the shift in the air, the quiet closing of ranks around the legacy they had tried to pocket for themselves. They couldn't spin the narrative anymore, not when the community had chosen its own truth. And me, I didn't feel like a lonely widow anymore. I felt like a keeper of stories, a guardian of something far greater than property. I felt alive. January arrived, bringing longer nights and biting winds, but inside my home something else had taken root. Momentum. Every evening, the lights in my kitchen stayed on, late voices, low but determined. The four of us sat around my old oak table, steaming mugs of tea between us, plotting something far bigger than revenge. We were planting truth in the open, carefully, strategically. That's when Patricia suggested it. An event. A seminar. Not some hidden protest, but a public gathering, dignified and inviting, built around the very idea that Blake and Chelsea were trying to exploit legacy. We won't mention them, Patricia said, her dark eyes glinting. We'll invite them. The idea settled into the room like fresh snowfall. Soft, quiet, yet impossibly powerful. The plan took shape quickly. We would host an open community event simply titled Preserving Legacy, Financial and Emotional Safeguards for Women. Donna drafted the guest list. Lucille handled logistics. Patricia designed tasteful invitations, elegant but simple, printed on cream cardstock, with a single emblem embossed at the top. The willow tree that had stood beside our house for over 70 years. We sent invitations to women all over the county. Teachers, small business owners, pastors' wives, young professionals. We made sure the town council members and the local zoning committee received theirs. We mailed a special invitation to a young reporter at the Renfield Gazette, a fresh-faced woman named Grace, who had recently written a compelling piece on local heritage preservation. And of course, one of the first invitations went directly to Chelsea. It was written with grace and tact, addressing her as a woman of modern vision, praising her community engagement, and extending a warm invitation to join our open panel and share her unique insights on modern development and women's financial empowerment. There was no resistance. Of course she accepted. It didn't surprise me. Chelsea loved attention. She loved an audience, especially when she could play the role of a forward-thinking, savvy businesswoman. She wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to showcase her polished ideas to the very community she thought she could outmaneuver. The days leading up to the event passed in a flurry of preparation. We borrowed chairs from the community center, set up a projector in my living room, and rearranged furniture to create a welcoming space. Lucille prepared informational packets, Donna baked muffins and ordered sandwiches, and Patricia filled the air with fresh-cut winter greenery. On the morning of the event, Willow Lake shimmered under a pale winter sun, the ice reflecting soft rays of light. Women arrived wrapped in wool coats and scarves, their footsteps crunching over the snow-dusted driveway. Laughter floated through the air as old friends reunited, many of them seeing each other again after years. Inside the living room filled quickly. The chairs faced a modest podium at the front, and a makeshift refreshment table sat to one side. I stood in the back corner, heart beating steadily, watching faces brighten as they took their seats. Chelsea arrived precisely 10 minutes before the start, punctual as always. Her hair perfectly curled, makeup flawless, wearing a blazer the color of fresh dollar bills. She breezed in with a bright smile, glancing around the crowded room, obviously pleased by the turnout. Blake followed closely behind his expression, more guarded, but still confident, his expensive wool coat spotless against the backdrop of simple community charm. I greeted them both with a polite smile and a firm handshake, my voice warm but unreadable. Chelsea returned the gesture with equal professionalism, likely thinking she had walked into a room of willing admirers. The seminar began with brief introductions. Donna welcomed everyone, highlighting the importance of safeguarding personal legacies, financially, emotionally, and spiritually. Lucille gave a small presentation on the history of women's communal spaces and the power of preserving them. Then, it was Chelsea's turn. Patricia introduced her, graciously speaking of Chelsea's modern perspective and valuable experience in community development. Chelsea took the podium like it was a stage, her confidence radiating across the room. She began smoothly speaking about the evolution of community spaces, about modernizing legacy properties for broader appeal. Her words flowed like silk, polished and market-tested. Then gradually her tone shifted from general ideas to specific ambitions. She spoke of potential, of profitability, of unlocking financial growth through underutilized properties. She referenced corporate retreats, wellness workshops, luxury accommodations. Chelsea's words wrapped the room in a corporate narrative, painting a future where community history was converted into lucrative packages, where heritage became marketable experiences and personal stories turned into branding material. She smiled as she spoke of scaling operations, her voice smooth, her hands animated. She framed it as innovation, as modernization, never once realizing the quiet, palpable discomfort settling over the audience. I glanced around. I saw eyebrows furrowing, heads tilting, arms folding defensively across chests. I caught the sharp glances exchanged between town council members seated in the back row, and I noticed Grace, the young reporter, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Chelsea's final flourish centered on what she called the Whitmore Haven Project, a name she spoke with pride, fully unaware that the air in the room had shifted. She ended her speech to scattered, hesitant applause. Then Donna took the stage again. "Thank you, Chelsea, for your insight," she said politely. "And now we have Mr. Harold Gordon joining us to speak on legal mechanisms for protecting legacy properties." Harold stood from his seat in the front row, small in stature but commanding in presence. He stepped to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and greeted the room with his steady, gravelly voice. "I've known the Whitmore family for decades." Harold began his words, calm but carrying weight. "And I've had the privilege of assisting Clara in recent months with a unique process, one I believe is crucial to preserving not just land, but purpose. You could have heard a pin drop." He explained in precise legal terms how the Whitmore family property, including the house, the dock, and surrounding land, had been transferred to the Voices by Willow Lake Fund. He spoke of the nonprofit structure, the protective bylaws, the permanence of the trust. This property, Harold said firmly, is no longer a privately held asset. It cannot be sold, subdivided, or developed into any commercial venture without unanimous consent of the board, which consists of community stewards dedicated to preserving its intended purpose. Harold paused, letting the silence deepen. To be clear, he continued, the Voices by Willow Lake Fund ensures this space will remain a haven for community enrichment, education, and empowerment. Forever. The room remained utterly silent, absorbing every word. My gaze shifted toward Chelsea. Her smile had frozen into something strained, her posture slightly rigid, her perfectly applied lipstick unable to mask the panic blooming in her eyes. Blake's jaw twitched, his confident veneer crumbling. This had not been the evening they had expected. When Harold finished, applause rippled through the room, not thunderous, but genuine, warm, and steady. Chelsea clapped along mechanically, trapped in the moment, realizing far too late that the narrative she had tried to craft had collapsed beneath her. I stood quietly in the back, watching as realization dawned in her eyes, as Blake's gaze darted toward me, confused and frustrated, and for the first time in a long while I felt no sadness, no anger. Only a quiet, anchored peace. This land was safe. My name was safe. Our legacy was safe. And there was not a single thing they could do to change that. When the room settled after the polite applause faded and the murmurs began, I knew it was my turn to speak. I hadn't planned on saying much. There was no need. The truth had already been spoken, the damage already done. But in the quiet that followed, every eye turned toward me, waiting. I stood slowly from my seat near the window, my joints aching from the long evening, but my back straight. I walked calmly to the podium where Harold had just stood, my fingers brushing the worn edge of the wooden lectern. I looked across the faces gathered in my living room, faces I had known for decades. Neighbors, friends, women I had mentored, and those I had simply shared smiles with in the aisles of the grocery store. I didn't look at Blake. I didn't look at Chelsea. This wasn't about them anymore. I let the room go still before I spoke. Legacy. I said, my voice soft but sure, is not something to be sold. It is a story to be carried forward. There was no need for dramatics, no need to explain or accuse. The words settled into the air, simple and final, and from the corners of the room I heard a few quiet sighs. The kind of sigh people release when something broken is set right again. I thanked everyone for coming, and I stepped down from the podium, my heart steady. My hands didn't tremble. I didn't feel weak or small. I felt anchored. As I returned to my seat, I allowed myself one glance toward the front row. Chelsea's face had lost its polished glow. She sat stiffly, her smile faltering, her fingers clenching the edge of her chair like she was holding on to something that had already slipped away. Her eyes, which so often danced with confidence and calculation, were now hollowed out with disbelief. Beside her, Blake sat with his head lowered, his jaw clenched, a man who had just realized too late that the house of cards he'd built had collapsed without a single raised voice. When the event concluded, people gathered in little groups, chatting softly, sharing memories of Willow Lake, reminiscing about past gatherings. There was laughter, there were hugs, and there was a shared sense of victory, not of one person over another, but of a community reclaiming something precious. Blake and Chelsea left quickly, heads low, shoulders tight. There were no goodbyes, no forced pleasantries, only the awkward shuffle of retreat. They slipped out the door into the cold, their departure quieter than I had imagined. That night, after the last chair had been stacked and the last cup rinsed, I stood in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, letting the silence settle around me like a warm blanket. It wasn't the oppressive silence I had known in the months before. It was calm, peaceful, satisfying. I brewed myself a fresh pot of tea, sat by the window, and watched the moonlight dance over the frozen lake. The next morning, the first calls started coming. Donna rang just after sunrise. Clara, words already spreading, she said, her tone bright. "You should have seen Councilman Abbott's face last night. He cornered me before I left, asking for more information about the trust." By noon, Lucille called, reporting that Grace from the Gazette had already sent her a draft of the article set to publish that Sunday, with the headline, "Local Women Secure Willow Lake Legacy." Then Patricia stopped by in the late afternoon, cheeks flushed from the cold eyes dancing with quiet satisfaction. "The gallery owner downtown already mentioned it," she said. "Apparently some of Blake's investor buddies were sniffing around for zoning changes. Not anymore." Over the next few days, the ripple effects moved through Renfield like a steady current. There were no public scandals, no angry confrontations, just a subtle but unmistakable shift in the air. The whispers began, and they weren't in Blake and Chelsea's favor. I heard it first at the hardware store. 2 men muttering about how some people try to cash in on their parents' life's work. At the post office, Mrs. Leland patted my arm and whispered, "It's good to see someone standing up for what really matters." By week's end, I learned the investors from the city had quietly pulled their interests from Blake's project. The local planning board sent out an announcement reinforcing zoning protections around Willow Lake, and Chelsea, who had always strutted confidently through town, found herself greeted with nods rather than smiles, quick hellos instead of warm conversations. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply existed within the calm aftermath, knowing the weight that had rested on my chest for months had finally lifted. On Sunday morning, the Gazette arrived at my doorstep, the front page headline as promised. Beneath it, a picture of Willow Lake blanketed in snow, the willow tree bending gently toward the frozen water. The article told the story of preservation, of heritage, of community strength. It spoke of the importance of safeguarding places that held stories too valuable to be sold, of legacies too deep to be reduced to marketing jargon. There was no mention of Blake or Chelsea. No accusations, no naming of villains. Only the quiet dignity of truth. Later that afternoon, I stood in the living room staring at the sleek leather folder that had sat untouched on my kitchen counter since that uncomfortable dinner all those weeks ago. The portfolio Blake had slid across the table with false smiles and empty reassurances. I picked it up, surprised by how light it felt now. Its weight, once crushing, had vanished. The fire was already burning in the hearth, crackling softly, casting a gentle glow across the room. I walked over, sat on the low bench, and opened the folder one last time. The documents inside were pristine, filled with complicated legal language and colorful charts promising growth, profitability, expansion. I flipped through them slowly, recognizing the language Chelsea had echoed during her speech. Strategies of transformation, community reinvention, maximizing assets. None of it mattered anymore. One by one, I fed the papers to the flames. The pages curled, darkened, and dissolved into ash. The fire hissed and cracked, the flames rising slightly as they consumed the carefully planned betrayal. The folder itself was last, leather blistering under the heat, buckling and folding in on itself before disappearing into embers. It wasn't an act of anger. It wasn't revenge. It was release. With each piece that vanished into the fire, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I had been in years. I stood by the window afterward, hands wrapped around a mug of warm cider, watching the smoke curl up the chimney, rising into the clear winter sky. Outside Willow Lake lay still and untouched, its frozen surface, reflecting the soft hues of the setting sun. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the old willow tree, not mournful but peaceful. I knew then that this place was safe. The stories would continue, the laughter would return. The land would remain sacred, not as property to be sold, but as a home for the hearts that needed it. I had taken back everything they tried to steal. My dignity, my history, my peace, and I had done it not through rage, not through vengeance, but through quiet strength. It was enough. More than enough. Spring came to Willow Lake quietly, melting the layers of snow, inch by inch, revealing patches of soft earth underneath. Where there had been silence and stillness, there was now the gentle drip of thawing icicles, the early calls of returning birds, and the first green shoots pressing their way through the damp soil. The house seemed to breathe again, the floors creaking in warmer afternoons, the windows letting in streaks of golden morning light. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a caretaker of a relic. I felt like a woman preparing a home for something new. The Voices by Willow Lake Fund had done more than protect this land. It had rekindled a purpose I thought I had lost. It reminded me of the joy of gathering, of teaching, of sharing spaces with women who simply needed room to be themselves. That spring, I brought back Ladies by Willow Lake. Not in the way it used to be, perhaps. There were no rigid schedules or formal programs, but the heart of it remained the same. Women came with their stories, with their laughter, with their worries, and I opened my doors to them. Donna helped organize a weekly baking circle. Every Thursday morning, the kitchen filled with the scent of fresh bread buttery biscuits and sweet fruit pies. Women came with their grandchildren in tow, kneading dough while toddlers played on the old woven rugs, their giggles echoing through the halls. There was something deeply healing in those mornings, in the way hands worked together, in the way recipes were shared between generations. Patricia brought life back to the porch with watercolor classes. Easels lined up facing the lake brushes, dancing in the hands of women young and old, capturing the shifting blues of the water, the sway of the willow branches, the golden daffodils that bloomed along the shore. I watched from my rocking chair, sipping iced tea, feeling warmth settle in my chest in a way I hadn't felt for years. Lucille hosted afternoon book circles in the living room where discussions flowed freely over cups of herbal tea and soft-spoken reflections. It wasn't about highbrow literature or intellectual debates. It was about connection, about women finding pieces of themselves in shared words. The house was alive again. Not in the manicured, polished way Chelsea had envisioned, but in the honest, imperfect way it was always meant to be. Children ran barefoot across the lawn. Women exchanged stories under the willow tree. Neighbors stopped by with fresh eggs or garden vegetables, staying longer than necessary just to soak in the simple joy of belonging somewhere. It was a slow revival, but a steady one. And then one afternoon in early June, the phone rang. I was sitting by the kitchen window sorting through a new batch of seed packets, considering where to plant the late bloomers. The caller ID showed Blake's name. My hand hovered over the receiver for a moment, my heart quiet but attentive. And then I answered. His voice came through the line, softer than I remembered, carrying the unmistakable weight of exhaustion. "Hi, Mom," he said, pausing as if unsure how to continue. I thought it was time I called. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting him fill it with whatever he needed to say. "I wanted to tell you, Chelsea and I, well, we've separated." He admitted the word, stumbling out awkwardly. "I've moved out, started over somewhere smaller. Things just didn't work." Another pause, then quieter. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for what we tried to do, for forgetting what mattered." I listened to the boy I once knew, wrapped inside the voice of a man who had clearly fallen hard, who had built his life on shaky ground and watched it crumble beneath him. The ache I thought would rise in my chest never came. There was no flare of anger, no lingering bitterness, only a soft, steady sadness. Not for what had been done to me, but for what my son had allowed himself to become, and what he had nearly destroyed along the way. I took a breath and answered gently, "I hope you find your peace, Blake. Truly I do." He waited, perhaps hoping for more. For comfort, for forgiveness, for some bridge to be rebuilt. But there was nothing left for me to offer in that moment except quiet kindness, and sometimes that was enough. "I just wanted you to know," he said finally, his voice brittle. I'll let you go now." "Take care of yourself," I said softly. And I meant it. When the line went dead, I sat there for a long while, letting the quiet settle around me, not as a burden, but as a balm. I didn't cry. I didn't stew in resentment. I didn't feel victorious or defeated, just free. I had let him go not out of spite, but because I had reclaimed my own life, my own joy. I no longer needed his approval or affection to feel whole. I had made peace with the woman I was, the life I had built, and the legacy I continued to nurture. The seasons turned and summer arrived in full bloom. Willow Lake sparkled under the sun, the water warm enough for early morning swims, the porch alive with friendly chatter. We hosted open garden days where local children helped plant rows of bright zinnias and marigolds, squealing when worms wriggled through the soil. There were music afternoons where Patricia's niece strummed her guitar under the willow-soft folk songs carrying across the breeze. We even revived the old end-of-summer bonfire tradition with stories told beneath the stars, flames flickering as marshmallows roasted over the crackling wood. There was no plaque marking ownership, no fancy website promising luxury experiences. There was no profit to be made, no sponsors to impress. Only life vibrant and true unfolding in simple moments of connection. Neighbors dropped by, unannounced old friends rekindled bonds. Young women found guidance in older voices, and I found companionship in laughter and shared meals, in the quiet satisfaction of a home that finally breathed again. I had thought this place would become my solitude, a retreat from a world that had forgotten me. Instead, it had become my foundation, my strength, my quiet triumph. Not through revenge, not through bitterness, through community, through honesty, through remembering who I was and what mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon one golden evening, I stood by the lake's edge, bare feet, pressed into the warm grass, and felt the earth beneath me. Steady, faithful, enduring. I closed my eyes, inhaled the sweet scent of summer blooms, and whispered to myself, not as a promise, but as a quiet truth, I am home. The heat of summer settled over Willow Lake in the gentlest way. Mornings started with golden light filtering through linen curtains. Afternoons were thick with the scent of wildflowers, and evenings ended in slow sunsets that painted the sky in soft oranges and deep purples. It had been many years since I'd seen the lake this vibrant, since I'd heard so much laughter echoing from its banks. This summer felt different. It felt alive. It was Patricia's idea to host a summer picnic, a celebration of everything we'd reclaimed, everything we'd protected. Not a fundraiser, not an awareness event. Just joy, pure and simple. A day where no one had to explain themselves or defend their choices. A day where women could simply be. We picked the last Saturday in July when the fields were at their greenest, and the lake shimmered like a mirror under the bright midday sun. Invitations went out the old-fashioned way. Phone calls, handwritten notes, a few friendly drop-ins to neighbors. Word traveled faster than we expected. By the morning of the picnic, the front yard was bustling with cars pulling into the long gravel drive, women piling out with baskets of food coolers packed with lemonade children skipping ahead with kites and rubber balls. Donna arrived first, carrying 2 pans of her famous peach cobbler. Lucille followed, arms full of folding chairs and a portable bookstand determined to turn one shady corner into a cozy little reading nook. Patricia brought paints and blank canvases, setting up an art station under the willow tree, where the branches bowed low and danced lazily in the summer breeze. I stood on the porch, watching it all unfold, my heart brimming in a way I hadn't known in years. By noon, quilts and picnic blankets stretched across the grass, mismatched and colorful. Women gathered in circles, passing around platters of roasted chicken potato salad, fresh cornbread, and berry pies that oozed sweetness. Laughter burst like fireworks, and the children's shrieks of joy cut through the still summer air as they darted between the trees, bare feet pounding against the soft ground. The house, once heavy with quiet, now thrummed with music. Someone had brought an old radio and tuned it to classic folk songs, the kind of music that felt timeless, unhurried. I wandered between groups, sipping iced tea, swapping stories, feeling the warmth of connection press softly against my skin. It had been so long since I had seen this place. My home, this full of life. Not orchestrated by profit, not curated for branding, but naturally, effortlessly joyful. It was everything I had feared I would lose, and everything I had quietly fought to preserve. Late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, Patricia approached me with a glint in her eye. She took my hand gently, her fingers firm around mine. "It's time, Clara," she said, voice playful. For what I asked, even though I already knew. She pointed toward the flat patch of grass near the old dock where several women were gathering, a portable speaker resting on a nearby picnic bench. "A little dancing," she said simply. "Come on." I hesitated, feeling the familiar tug of age and hesitation tighten around me. I hadn't danced, truly danced, in over 30 years. The last time had been on this very lawn, swaying in David's arms during one of our anniversary dinners, barefoot under the stars. My fingers brushed the edges of my shawl, remembering how it had felt to be light on my feet, to move without care, to laugh without restraint. Then I looked around me, at the women smiling, waiting, welcoming, and I took a deep breath. Why not? I slipped off my shoes, letting my toes sink into the cool grass, and let Patricia lead me toward the group. The speaker crackled to life with a soft folk tune, the kind you didn't have to count steps for, the kind where you just followed the rhythm in your chest. It started slowly with small steps and quiet sways. Then the music shifted into something livelier, and I felt my muscles remember forgotten movements. My hips loosened, my shoulders relaxed, and soon I was laughing, really laughing, as we twirled and spun beneath the wide open sky. The music grew bolder, more joyful. I didn't care how I looked. I didn't care if my steps were offbeat or my knees ached just a little. I danced because I wanted to, because I could. I caught glimpses of the women around me. Some young, some older, some moving gracefully, others clumsily, none of it mattering in the slightest. It was freedom, pure and tangible, lifting us from the heaviness of the world and settling us into the simplest, most powerful joy to be alive and to move with it. When the song slowed, when our feet were tired and our chests full of breathless laughter, I leaned back, turning my face toward the sky. The sun hovered just above the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the rippling lake, and I felt the warmth of it kiss my skin. Patricia squeezed my hand, her smile wide, her cheeks flushed. "You're radiant," she whispered. I laughed, wiping the sweat from my brow. "I feel it." Later, as the sun dipped lower, we gathered by the water's edge. Some sat on blankets, others perched on picnic benches. Children chased fireflies. Someone strummed a guitar softly in the background. I stood a little apart, watching the scene before me. Women sharing stories, children giggling, friends leaning into each other, shoulders touching heads, tilting back in laughter. Willow Lake reflected it all, calm and unbothered, timeless. It would have been so easy for this to have been taken away, for this land to be paved over, for these moments to have never happened. I pressed a hand gently over my heart, feeling its steady rhythm, and closed my eyes. They had tried to take my home. They had tried to erase my name, my memories, my purpose, but I had reclaimed it all. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through quiet, deliberate strength. I hadn't just saved the land. I had saved myself. As the evening drew to a close, I sat by the dock, letting my bare feet dangle above the cool water. The willow branches swayed above me, the leaves whispering secrets in the soft breeze. I smiled to myself, a smile that carried no bitterness, no regret, only peace. I didn't need approval. I didn't need acknowledgement from those who had tried to betray me. I had everything I needed. I had community. I had purpose. I had freedom. And above all, I had myself. Whole, strong, quietly joyful. Even after betrayal, even after loss, even after being forgotten by those I loved the most. I had learned to be full again. As the stars blinked into view, and the moonlight traced soft ripples on the lake's surface, I let out a soft laugh, one that no one heard but me. I had danced under the open sky. I had laughed until my cheeks ached. I had stood tall on my own 2 feet. And in the quiet rhythm of the waves, I heard the only truth that mattered. I was free. Thank you for spending this time with me. If Clara's journey touched your heart, I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect. Have you ever felt overlooked by the very people you gave everything to? Have you ever had to quietly reclaim your own dignity? Maybe you've had to stand your ground not through shouting, but through silent strength. I would love to hear your story in the comments. Share with me a moment when you found your voice, when you chose peace over bitterness, or when you discovered your true worth in the quietest way. And if this story made you feel seen, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means more than you know. When you subscribe and turn on the notification bell, you'll never miss these heartfelt journeys of strength, healing, and quiet victories. Let's build a community where no woman feels invisible, where every quiet voice finds a place to be heard. I'll be here waiting to listen, and I hope you'll be here too. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and stay true to yourself.